Here.
Senator Neal, Senator Parrott,
Here.
Senator Wilson, Representative Duplessis, Representative Graham, Representative Petrie,
Here.
Representative Weber,
Here.
Representative Wheatley,
Here.
Mike Harmon, John Hicks,
Here.
Victor Maddox, Sharon Mattingly, Jerry Miller, Jimmy Higdon,
Here.
Senator Higdon, I'm sorry,
So you got
And-
it right the first time. You're good.
Representative Tipton.
Here.
We do have a quorum, right?
Yes.
We do have a quorum. First order of business, I entertain a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting. We have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, second. Motion's been made and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. The minutes are approved. Where's my? All right, we have some guests with us today. How we pronounce it? Vivian, okay. Vivian Clark, she's from Mentor High School in Lake County, Ohio. She's here today shadowing. Let's make her welcome this morning, or this afternoon. We also have with us today Candy Massaroni. She's a newly elected state representative in the 50th House District. She won the primary. She has no opponent in the fall. So I want to welcome Candy to our committee meeting today. Welcome. Okay, our first item on the agenda today is Bo Barnes, TRS sick leave. Bo, the floor is yours. Identify yourself for the record, please, and please proceed.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Bo Barnes. I serve as Deputy Executive Secretary and General Counsel for the Teachers Retirement System. And I have been asked today to make a presentation, a follow-up presentation on sick leave and sick leave-related items. Let's see, okay, very good. And with that, I'll dig in. Since the sick leave-related items I'm going to ask to talk about today include the budget, I included this slide. It's just a real quick recap of the budget that was enacted during the most recent session for the upcoming 2022-2024 biennium. So again, this budget was great news for teachers. It provided additional funding that the retirement system needed, and it marks the 8th straight year of full or very near full funding for the pension fund. So very appreciative of that. It added an additional more than $1.36 billion we needed to implement our funding plan to pay off that legacy unfunded liability, which we have less than 23 years left in that amortization period to pay off that legacy unfunded liability, at which point when we're 100% funded, again, I've said this before, but the cost to the Commonwealth that we will be billed, will be a little bit less than Social Security in today's dollars. The budget also provided over the 2-year period, the $1.36 billion is over the 2-year period. It also provided over the 2-year period $149 million for under 65 retiree health insurance under the shared responsibility legislation. And then also an additional $479.2 million to pay off certain liabilities that were being paid for on an amortized basis. And I'm going to discuss those a little bit more in the next slide. And then the last item on this slide is $78 billion over the 2-year period to pay for sick leave-related liabilities that was requested in our budget from last fall. So let's go into a little more detail with this next slide. Okay, and with this slide, I know the top says sick leave components. Really more accurately, that should be something, it's those second bullet point to the last I was just talking about, the $479.2 million for these past liabilities are being amortized over a 20-year basis, something we call Greenbox Dollars, commonly referred to down here as the Greenbox Dollars. So this really is Greenbox dollar components that I'm going to be talking about on this slide. And again, there were some benefits that were being paid for, not in lump sum in each budget. They were being paid for, and this started in the late 1990s, but they were being paid for, rather than a lump sum each budget, they were being paid for on an amortized basis over 20 years, okay? And this $479.2 million paid off those amortized liabilities for good, okay? So those are now paid off. The Greenbox Dollars are paid off fully, and there's two components to those Greenbox Dollars. The first is sick leave, okay? And specifically, sick leave as it's used in retirement calculation purposes as salary credit. So one more time, again, just so everyone's on the same page, sick leave as salary credit means that when school districts, they may, under statute, they may compensate their retiring teachers for their unused sick leave at 30% of their daily rate. And then that lump sum payment is added to their last annual salary if the district chooses to do it, and they all do it. But that lump sum payment is added to their last annual salary for retirement calculation purposes. And the state pays the actuarial cost of using that lump sum payment for sick leave as salary credit. And for all those past sick leave payments and those amortized payments, about $380 million of that $479.2 million retired those Greenbox Dollars for sick leave. The other component of the Greenbox Dollars, besides the sick leave, are there some old supplemental cost of living adjustments. Now, I know we've talked about this before this body before, but teachers by statute, they have a 1.5% annual COLA built into their statute, built into the contribution rate. And in past budgets, and it's been a while, it's been since 2008 when, budgets were a little bit better, there's more revenue. From time to time, the budget would provide additional funding for a COLA over and above that 1.5% COLA. And though the cost of that, which was paid for by the state, was not paid for a lump sum, it was also paid for on a 20-year amortized basis. And so this $479.2 million paid off all those old amortizations of those old supplemental cost of living adjustments that we still had because they're 20-year amortizations. Even though the last supplemental COLA was 2008, we still have that. And that's about $100 million of this $479.2 billion that retired those Greenbox Dollars, if you will.
Oh, can I ask you a question? If you
Yes,
don't
sir.
mind? One of the back in the early discussions about the Greenbox Dollars, it mentioned that some of the Greenbox Dollars, some of the $100 million and COLA payoff was from 2003 and 2004. Is that, or was it all from 2008?
No, the 2008 was the last year that a supplemental COLA above the 1.5% was provided, but we still have payments going back to 2003 and 4, that early because they're 20-year payments, and we're just now in fiscal year 2022. So you have more than just the 2008 year involved in there. Those were all set to sunset 2028, because of the 20-year amortization, we'd have all those paid off. But you still have several years of those supplemental COLAs that we're paying on. Let me correct that. Those are now paid for. So what did the $479 million do for the Commonwealth? Well, first, it saved the Commonwealth $230 million in debt service. In other words, interest that the Commonwealth was paying on those amortized payments. So huge savings, $230 million savings by paying $479.2 million today. That drops the cost of sick leave going forward by about 1% of payroll, or about $39 million a year, okay? And I have some more slides. I'll talk about this a little bit. I'm sorry.
Oh, I want to interrupt you one more time.
Yes, sir.
That's a big deal to pay those Greenbox Dollars off, and so fortunate that we could do that. And hats off to Representative Petrie and the A&R chair in the House, and Senator McDaniel in the Senate as and our chairman and the conference committee for seeing the value of that $479 million, which could be used for a lot of things. But to use it, one of the most important things we do is eliminate that pension liability. So hats off to those folks. Certainly appreciate it. Representative Tipton has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification, Bo, I know we've been over this a few times, but it's always good to get clarification. The $380 million in sick days, that was for retirees.
Yes.
The cost of retirees for
Yes.
sick days.
Yes.
There's also, and that's where that savings is coming from. And I think in the budget we had in each year $39 million to cover the cost on an ongoing basis over the next 2 years. That sound about right?
Yes, sir.
But that does not reflect the value of the active teacher sick day. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, what percent of the ADEC how much of the ADEC goes to cover that?
I can answer that now, or I have a slide that gets into more detail on that,
that's
which whether you prefer. Okay.
That's fine, thank you.
So, but by state law, we are to submit our budget in the fall, so we do that. And last fall, we submitted that budget request for that year's crop of retiring teachers for their liability for sick leave. And for the 2-year period, the budget that we submitted last fall was $78 million, or about $39 million a year. And that budget reflects where we were before those Greenbox dollars got paid off. Because on this previous slide, at the bottom, the savings by this paying off these Greenbox dollars on the sick leave side is about 1% of pay, or $39 million annually. That fits in with the Greenbox dollar budget request. So going forward in the future, there will not be a direct line item budget request for each year's retiring class of teachers in that $39 million amount. That will be gone. So what we're going to be left with is what I'm going to be showing you on the next slide for future budgets. And for the active teacher cost, okay, and there's an active teacher cost that, in addition to that line item budget request, it is part of what we call the ADEC, the Actuarially Determined Employer Contribution. It is part of that total contribution, and the cost of that going forward. And I really need to, there's some qualifications with this, because this cost is going to change in a big way. And I need to explain that to give you the full picture of where we're headed in the future. But for the more immediate budgets, the cost of active teacher sick leave use as salary credit is 1.2% of payroll. That's about $45 million annually, okay, was what will be requested. We could be the portion of the ADEC to pay for that liability for active teachers. That provides both for the normal cost of active teacher sick leave. It also is paying off the unfunded liability on active teacher sick leave. And just like with the pension, because it's part of that, it's all part of the liabilities, we have less than 23 years to pay on the sick leave. And I'm going to explain in a second why the dynamics on that are completely changing, okay, because of recent legislation. But if we didn't have the unfunded liability for active teacher sick leave, the normal cost would be 0.4% of payroll. So you can see most of that 1.2% is for the unfunded liability. But without the unfunded liability, 0.4%, about $15 million annually. But this is getting already changed. I mean, this is what's going to happen with future budgets. And, that $45 million, I need to note this, it will go up slightly every year in more current, more immediate budgets, because it increases every year with payroll growth. That is assumed to be 2.75%. But countering that growth is the fact that in 2008 there was uniform pension legislation for all the retirement systems, and among the things it did at TRS is it capped sick leave for salary credit purposes to 300 days at a max. And that's not most of our members, obviously, but it's we do have a number of members who have very long careers, and they've not used sick leave. So they retire with more than 300 days, but those folks will now be capped. But even more significantly, as a result of House Bill 258, which was enacted during the 2021 session, the future accrual of sick leave liability for active teachers ends with anyone becoming a member on or after January 1st. A wall was erected at that date, and there's no new accrual for active teachers for sick leave liability. So we are going to start seeing a downward trend because, again, this is active teacher liability, and we're not adding any more, so you're going to see a slow downward trend, and eventually sick leave, out in the future, there will be no liability for it. It'll be gone. Whoops, let me stay here. But this is not. I don't have a slide for this, but I was asked about this in a previous meeting, and this is the use of annual days being converted for sick leave purposes. And I spoke to this body before about that, or to remind folks who may not have been here at the last meeting, attended, a reminder about what that is, and then also a little more detail about that. So typically, and we have 171 school districts, okay? 171. So no one, people are different. You see a lot of different things across the board about how they're handling annual leave, okay? But typically, most commonly, and we refer to it internally, informally, as the 10 annual leave days, because most school districts are providing 10 annual days. Some provide less, some provide more annual days, but typically it's 10 annual leave a day. And as I reported last time, there are 2 districts that allow unused annual leave days to roll over into sick leave days. If they're unused, they allow unused annual leave days to roll over into sick days. Now, this is conditional and it's limited. The accrual of annual leave days is conditional. For example, how many years of service do you have? That depends. You get more annual days with more years of service you have, for example. There are limitations, conditions on the use of annual days that can be rolled over for sick leave. So it is conditional and limited. But we do have 2 districts, and we have a cooperative that allow the rollover conditionally in a limited manner, that will allow the rollover annual leave days into sick leave days. And we discussed last time too. I just want to make sure that I answered this the last time we discussed it. But approximately 95% of our members are in the school districts, and the remaining are state agencies and the universities. Only school districts may voluntarily decide to make that lump sum payment to allow unused sick leave to be used for retirement calculation purposes. The other 5% of our employers cannot allow sick leave to be used as salary credit, to add to their last annual salary. They can, and it's up to the employer, because it's not mandatory, but it's discretionary with those other employers, that 5%. They may allow their retiring members to use unused sick leave as service credit. So not as increasing their salary, but increasing their service at the end of their career. So, for example, someone retires with 30 years of service, and they have 100 unused sick leave days. That employer may make the decision that they are going to allow them to use that 100 days. So they will retire not with 30 years, they will retire with 30 years and 100 days of service. Now, that statute requires that employer, not the state, but that employer, to pay the actuarial cost of sick leave when it's applied as salary credit. So it's a completely different bucket, but I just want to make sure that I fully explained that from our last meeting. And there's something else that I raised with the co-chairs from last meeting when we discussed the rollover of annual leave. There's something else in the districts. And this applies not just to, year-round calendar folks who get annual leave. Teachers don't get annual leave. They have the summer breaks. But there's something else in the districts. It's called personal leave, okay? And again, we have 171 districts, and they're all different. But most districts grant their employees, including their teachers, 1 to 3 personal days a year. And most are going to allow those to roll over unused personal leave on a conditional, limited basis, in many cases, allow that unused personal days to roll over into sick leave, okay? And again, it can be conditional or limited. For example, we have a district that gives 3 personal days, but they only allow 1 day to roll over into sick leave. So again, 171 districts, and they're just doing different things, but they are within a pretty tight window of what they're doing out there with the personal days. And I think that was all the questions that I had about the the annual leave rolling over and the personal leave being able to roll over. But certainly if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to take those now.
Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Bo. Just kind of a follow-up to my question before. Going forward, the ADEC is going to be about 1.2% of payroll. Is that for current teacher?
Yes, sir.
So that's about $45 million.
Yes, sir.
In addition to the $39 million for retiree teacher that's going to start going down.
The $39 million, that budget request, now that we know the Greenbox dollars are paid, that budget request will not be made in future budgets.
So everything will be rolled over into the ADEC payment.
Yes, you're just going to see that.
So we'll just see that 1.2%.
Yes,
so
sir.
We're looking at about a $45 million cost.
Yes, sir.
For current retiree and current teacher going forward.
Yes, sir. And you'll see that go up with payroll about 2.75% in immediate budgets. And then out there, years out, it's going to start going down as we have more and more teachers in that new tier.
If I could have one quick follow-up additional question. That 5% of employers you're referring to, are you referring to university employees, KDE employees? What category of employers are we referring to there?
The biggest group would be the universities, and probably the second biggest would be KDE. But you have some other groups out there, Educational Professional Standards Board, education-related groups, entities that participate in TRS. And not all of those grants, like we have 2 universities that don't give sick leave. We have, universities that are employers that don't allow for them to be used as salary credit, But again, if they do, they have to pay the cost.
Senator Mills has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bo, just wanted to make sure I was hearing this right and ask one question. So the annual leave you talked about, a small amount of people, and those organizations actually pay for those days that are rolled. Is that correct?
So for the 5% of our employers who are not school districts, when they make the decision to compensate their employees for unused sick leave as service credit, then they have to pay the full actuarial cost of that. We do not bill the state. The state is not charged for the actuarial cost of that like the state is for those school districts when the unused sick leave is paid for at lump sum at 30% of the daily rate and incorporated as salary credit in their last year's salary.
Okay. And then to go on to the personal leave, the 1 to 3 days that may vary between each school district, when those days are allowed to roll into sick leave, are those paid for by the school district annually, or are they paid for by the state?
No, since those are converted to sick leave, and they're reported to us just as sick leave from the district, then since it's a district sick leave, then the state would be billed for the cost of that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Representative Petrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really quickly, when the budget requests were put in for $39 million a year, the effect of payment of Greenbox dollars was not known at that point.
Correct.
Okay. So with the payment of the Greenbox dollars paid in full, is the $39 million necessary at this point?
There will be no future budget request for that. That $39 million will go into, it's considered, when we're making as part of the future budget request, going out long term, it is additional funding for the pension fund, which will be
what I'm
reflected.
looking at is this. We have Greenbox dollars that would have been factored into the requests, and the $39 million would have been addition to that with the paying off the Greenbox dollars. Is the $39 million even necessary at this point for related purposes?
No, not for the sick leave.
Okay, so for the 39 million that was set aside in the next 2 years of the biennium under current coming budget, that's just extra 39 million per year that is allocated at this point with no line item purpose.
Not a line item purpose. It does go, to funding the pension fund, and it gets it to a better funded position. But
Okay. So you would, rather than it going to Greenbox Dollars, that 39, or for the sick leave payments, that 39 million will be reworked for the purpose of paying down liabilities.
yes,
For funding
yes,
the system.
Yes. So the actuaries look at this really comprehensively. What are the liabilities of the system? And those are reported. Our annual financial report is sort of a lump sum number. This is the outstanding liability of the system. So those $39 million each year are not needed for these next 2 years' retiree classes. They will go towards, yes, generally the pension itself. So it'll be additional funding for the pension. It will not be applied to sick leave.
So it'll be 78 million over the next 2 years applied additionally to what we had planned going toward the pension system itself.
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hicks has a question.
Thanks, Senator Higdon. I want to kind of repeat what Representative Petrie said, maybe in a different way. The Greenbox dollars in your budget request were for past liabilities amortized over a 20-year term.
Yes.
And so the $39 million a year in your request was kind of the pre-funded cost of the upcoming biennium's sick leave credit because we didn't have any ad hoc COLAs. That was kind of if you paid your mortgage for the next 2 years today, you paid $39 million instead of amortizing it over 20 years. And so now you're saying, Bo, that we're going to now see all that wrapped up into the actuarially determined contribution in the future. It's not going to be a separate element. It's, just like in the KPPA system, the comp time payout to an individual that goes to their salary credit, is buried into the ADAC. And now, rather than separating these pieces in your budget request, it's going to be buried in your ADAC.
It will actually, because there was a separation sort of for active teacher liability and retired teacher liability, that will, and we have those dollars paid off, and we've got almost $500 million coming in. Our actuary says we have a 1% reduction in payroll, which is really the equivalent to the $39 million a year. So instead of in future budgets, the $39 and the $45 million both being part of the total budget request, one a line item, one ADEC, we're doing away with the line item $39 million, and that will just leave the approximately $45 million, the 1.2% of pay, which will grow each year again with payroll growth. And eventually it'll start a downward trend. Does that, I understand your question correctly?
Director Hicks, thank you. If I remember correctly, I wrote it down right, we had 375 million Greenbox dollars that belonged to, sick days for retired teachers. We had 534 million dollars on current liability, unfunded liability for current teachers, for a total of $909 million that we had liability for sick days. And we're paying off 375, so we end up now with 534 million unfunded liability for current sick days, and that's what we'll be working on from now on. Those for those current teachers.
And let me, if I may, Mr. Chair. Sometimes when we're discussing these things, there's questions back and forth. I'm not sure if I've always followed up with questions in past meetings, but I want to be clear on that. The $538 million represents, there are a lot of questions about sick leave and this budget having additional funding and maybe doing something just to retire sick leave. So we had a request to, how much would it take to pay for sick leave going forward, so that there would be no cost for sick leave at all, not even normal cost. We would just be looking at every year you're going to have little gains and loss. We always do. And we amortize those over a 20-year period. So you'd have some small margin of gains lost, but other than that, there would be no cost assigned to sick leave. There wouldn't be that normal cost even for sick leave, the 45 million. And that's super pre-funding a plan. But if we look at how we sort of value liabilities for just the pension and other assets, we anticipate that we are going to still get money in. We're going to get that normal cost, okay? And normal cost is what we need to put aside each year that with, most importantly, investment income, we can make sure those teachers' benefits are going to be paid when they retire. So the 538 million represents an even greater, savings out of the budget because we're not asking for the normal cost. If we continue with and this is what our actuaries will do with what the cost of sick leave is, with still getting the normal cost is, and valuing sick leave liability just like we do other pension liability, it would be $408 million. Would be what we'd be looking at for actually liability of sick leave is what our actuaries built in.
Another question. Of course, we talk about 10 to 12 annual days that some districts are doing, and 1 to 3 personal days that some districts are doing, and then you have 2 districts that are doing something else. Was that ever the the intended use of when? With sick days, is that something that TRS okayed, or was that legislatively done?
That was done by legislation. It's a Department of Education statute. It's KRS 161-155 for sick leave as salary credit.
That's not administrative reg. That's statute.
It is outside. All the TRS's only role is sick leave days get reported to us, and then by statute we're required to incorporate that in the last annual salary. And we don't set sick leave policy. We didn't ask for sick leave as salary credit. That was something that was done. That goes back quite a while. I know their actuary had some concerns at the time about making sure the cost of sick leave was recovered because it was a benefit improvement, a new benefit adjustment. So I have seen at some time in my life, the retirement system over 20 years plus, an actual report where I did note that there were concerns back in the day.
Is that something that TRS would do, clarify to all school districts so everybody is treating sick days the same? Is that something you would do, or is that something we need to do legislatively to make sure that everybody is doing the same thing?
No, TRS has no authority to do that. I mean, we have a very, very limited role. It's really just automatic. It's dollars reported for sick leave. We add it to their last salary, and then we calculate the retirement based on that. That's our only role. We don't request, we don't encourage, we don't promote. That is just something that is completely external of TRS. Ours is just an automatic calculation.
Okay, well, one thing I do want to do, and we'll send you a letter to ask for this, is a letter back from the actuary explaining detail because it's still clear as mud to some of us, and those listening to this broadcast. We need to know exactly how much we owe, how much we're going to pay each year, and I know there might be some variation in that going forward, but I think we need to see it in writing from the actuary what this costs and what we pay every year, and know exactly going forward where we stand on sick leave and the unfunded liability. And I'll send you a letter, and then like I said, we get something in writing where we all know, and Representative Petrie and Chairman McDaniel will know every year what you're going to be requesting, and folks here on PPOB and other legislators, we can share that with them. So one of the things that we really need to do is make sure that more people understand the pension system. And I think one of the reasons we have unfunded liabilities is things were done years ago because a lot of people didn't understand about unfunded liability and making sure that these pension systems were properly funded. So I'll get that letter to you, and maybe you can get it back to us by the next meeting. I'd appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Senator Meek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to make sure I heard this right and make sure I'm absorbing it correctly. The $78 million that was budgeted, that Representative Petrie was asking about, that $78 million that was budgeted, is that going toward the legacy debt of the teacher's pension now that those Greenbox dollars are paid off? Is that correct?
That is correct. Again, it's going toward the total liabilities of the system. And, we don't do line item budget requests for individually sick leave or, these other items. It's just, it goes to pay down the total liabilities, which it is that legacy unfunded liability. It will help pay that down more quickly, yes.
Okay. Technically, I guess we could claw that back because we paid it back twice. Is that correct?
That's a policy decision of the Commonwealth.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Bo, thank you, and appreciate your being candid with us on all those questions. I know it was a lot, so and I will get you a letter so we can get some clarification.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Brad, we'll turn the floor over to you, and if you would, identify yourself for the record, and the floor is yours. Please proceed.
My name is Brad Gross. I'm the Committee Staff Administrator of the Public Pension Oversight Board. And today, Mr. Chairman, as we talked about earlier a couple weeks ago, in some of the discussions was to talk a little bit about retiree health benefits and funding. Sir, you used the great analogy you've used before, clear as mud. This was clear as mud back in 2004. It has not gained clarity over the time. It has become much more complex. And as I was sitting there with 30 or 40 slides this weekend, I decided to whittle it down to 10 or 11 to try to provide a little bit of clarity. And it is a little bit of a blast from the past for those of you who have been around for a while. To kind of start off, I was going to talk a little bit about the national perspective. Retiree health benefits for public employees have often been referred to in a broader class known as post-employment benefits, or OPEB, which vary among states and in Kentucky. And if you were to go back far enough, in fact, back in 2004, 2005, 2006, OPEB benefits were just kind of off books, if you will. And the Governmental Accounting Standards Board issued statements number 43 and 45, which kind of, if you will, pulled back the curtains, if you will, to see what all the different states had in relationship to OPEB benefits. And at that time, I remember the discussions were, this is going to be big, people are going to make huge changes across the nation, and we have seen some changes, but we haven't seen the broad changes completely across the nation, as you would see, but there have been some things as we kind of move forward. Now, those standards are now replaced by newer standards, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So to kind of give some perspective nationally, when we look at most states on OPEB benefits, most states are on a pay-as-you-go basis, and that means that enough money is set aside in the year to pay for the benefits that go out in that year. And so there's not money set aside traditionally like pension benefits to pre-fund it. If you'll look at the state of Kentucky, now we have varied in our systems when you look at different ones, but we are now at a place where we are paying the full actuarially determined contributions, and in some cases more than that, so that we are, from a true kind of actuarial pre-funded status, pre-funding our retiree health benefits. So if you were to look at publications, sometimes the state of Kentucky is not viewed very favorably in the pension world, but on the retiree health end, we are considered a solid performer as far as the monies that we have set aside, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. As far as benefits are concerned, most states provide retiree health benefits under three common broad plan designs. One would be a percentage of the premium, and we've had that in our state in years past and currently, where a certain percentage of the premium, some cases the full premium was paid. That is the one which is probably lost a little bit of steam as it's moved forward because you do expose yourself to medical inflation. And that's one of the reasons why you see back in 2003 and 2004 that there were changes made to our KPPA systems. The fixed dollar subsidies are exactly what they are. It's just a certain dollar amount that you receive as a retiree that don't adjust with the medical premiums. We also have that would be our Tier 1Bs, Tier 2s, Tier 3s. In our KPPA systems, they get a certain dollar amount towards their retiree health benefits when they retire. And that's certainly raised some questions in the last year or so, and we had a bill that addressed a little bit of that. The implied subsidy is that one benefit as a retiree is if I'm included in the same class as active employees. Right. And I'm not saying retirees are more expensive. It's just as you get older, I take blood pressure medicine now. I used to not take blood pressure medicine, wished I didn't take blood pressure medicine. But as you get older, typically your claims are higher. And so in our KEHP plan, our plan that we provide to state employees, school employees, and also our non-Medicare eligible retirees are in that same pool. So you get the benefit of a pooled group, which is often referred to as an implied subsidy, if you will. And certainly as we look down in our state, we have kind of everything. We used to all be on percentages of premiums if we looked across our systems. Now this is where it gets a lot more, of losing clarity. It gets a little more muddy as we've moved along. When you look at most states, there are very few legal protections. It may have been a budgetary item that was listed, a subsidy or something like that. Most of ours is built within a statutory scheme. Some could be argued, parts of an inviolable contract. Some systems, it's up, like for TRS, it's up to the board to determine a subsidy based upon the availability of funding. And lastly, kind of the administration and funding, we're a little bit unique in the fact that our retiree health benefits are a part of our retirement funds. And what I mean by that is, so when you get a bill that comes over from TRS or KERS and you're looking at it in the budget, it's going to include a pension cost and a retiree health cost. It's not that other states don't have that. It's that those would be done sometimes through a different entity, through their personnel cabinet, if you will, or through maybe a health insurance agency that is dealing with that in that state. So that sometimes gets to be a little bit confusing. The retirement systems handle a lot of the day-to-day information and talk with members and have counselors that handle a lot of that discussion. So it's a little bit different as we kind of look at Kentucky and we look at most states. Per NCSL, a 2020 NCSL legislative brief, nationwide, if we were to take all the retiree health liabilities that were out there at one time, about 7% were funded with assets. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we are nationally, is that most people are still on a pay-as-you-go basis. There has still been some improvement as we look across the states, but it's still largely on a pay-as-you-go basis. And like pensions, we used to have one set of numbers. This is the fun thing. We now have 3, 4, 5 sets of pension numbers, depending upon which conference you go to, who you talk to. At one time, our GASB standards and our funding standards that we had in the valuation were the same. Now with our new GASB standards, they are divorced from each other. So we have a funding number that will be what I talk about today. We have the GASB numbers, which on OPEB are typically a little bit higher because of the assumptions, implicit subsidies that are built into that. But you'll also see bond rating agencies. You'll see think tanks. When I went to do some research on this, I found some wildly different numbers depending upon who I looked at and what year it was produced. So kind of moving forward, there's some documents in that handouts that I included. One was from the Center for State and Local Government Excellence. It's a one-page sheet, has a lot of good information in a small amount of space. There's also 2 additional publications that are in there, one being one from NCSL that I also thought was a good little short piece. And then if you wanted to see kind of a comparison of state by state with a little more detail, there's a survey that was done a couple of years ago in there as well too, if you need something to get you to sleep tonight. So that being said, I do think those 2 smaller publications are good. The one thing I will say is anytime you read survey data, you always go look at your own state, see if it's correct. It's moderately correct. which means to tell you that it's partially correct or gives you a good idea in general, but don't rely upon it. So kind of the idea, of pre-funding is we're going to have assets that are set aside. And I thought this was a good chart that was in one of these publications that kind of showed where in 2017, where were the distribution of OPEB assets, money set aside for retiree health. And you can see technically we're fourth, but all other states are listed fourth in this. So to give you an idea of how much money was out there in FY17 set aside for that, hey, we were in the top 5 here collectively as Kentucky. And at that point, we had $5.9 billion of assets set aside. Today, FY21, I should say, at the end of FY21, we were closer to $9.5 billion. So that number is improving as we're putting the full arc in, and in some cases, more than the full arc. I also thought this was a good document to kind of look at. This looked at back before we had the new standards, back when the funding standards and the GASB standards were pretty similar. This kind of gave you an idea of what were the OPEB unfunded liabilities by state per capita. And so the state of Kentucky, you can see there with $1,411 per person in OPEB liabilities. Now, certainly as it moves down towards the orange and yellow, that means you have a lot more. As it moves towards the darker blue, you have less. I just kind of pulled up what ours is today. At this time, when this was done, we had about $6.2 billion of OPEB unfunded liabilities. Today, we have closer to 3.2. Our population hasn't changed much, so we can kind of say we're probably somewhere about half that on similar standard basis. This is always kind of a funny little chart to look at. Is years ago when people came to testify, they would say we have a retiree health problem, we don't have a pension problem. And that was largely true. We do have some 2006 data, but not for all systems, but it would have been close to 60% of the liabilities at that time were retiree health instead of pension. Today, you can look and see that pension has grown, and certainly that's starting to become more under control and to drop for some of our systems. But you can see that the OPEB liabilities or retiree health liabilities are $3.2 billion and now 7% instead of 51%. And in the last 2 years, you can see down below there how we've had a reduction each year in those. So one of the questions always is, why did things get better? Well, there's probably a lot of reasons we get down there. There have been several reform packages with KPPA, our KERS, CERS, and SPRS systems. We've transitioned from a percentage of the premium to a fixed dollar amount, which has reduced our cost over time. There has been an increase in the employee contribution rate. TRS, they had the shared solution provisions back in 2010. There were some small changes in 8, but I'll really probably focus on the shared solution where they had employees pay more, school districts chipped in contributions, the state paid more, the state bonded, and I'll kind of go over those in a minute. And we've seen that fund rapidly improve over the last couple of years. And then certainly JFRS, they had changes in 2013 that essentially mimicked what KPPA has gone through. And certainly as we had a movement to full funding, again, most states were on a pay-as-you-go basis. We're now out now. All of our funds are on a actually pre-funded model. KPPA and JFRS, they have an actually determined contribution. TRS has statutory rates from the shared solution, and as that fund has improved, that statutory rate is above the actuarially determined contribution, which means it gets better quicker as long as that's paid. The other thing, too, is we've had a really good positive actuarial experience in our health plans, particularly as it relates to the Medicare eligible population. Premiums across those plans, and I'll show this in a minute, have been pretty flat over the course of time. And that's largely due to Medicare Modernization Act, which provided subsidies for us to continue providing prescription drug coverage to our Medicare eligible population. So we got some money from the feds. The retirement systems have done a really good job of trying to farm out those monies to get as much as possible. Believe it or not, there's a lot of ways to do it. And they've been pretty creative in trying to find ways to keep those costs down as well, too. So This gives you a picture of where were we in 2007 as funding levels for our retiree health funds. Where were we at today? And so one of the things you can see today in that 2021 valuation column is we now have 3 funds that are above 100% funded, one at 136, the other 2 at 273 and 363. Now, one of the things we looked at back when investment returns were really good, and that's what we have as of the last valuation, what would things look like in 5 years once these investment returns are phased in? And so you can see these funds are continuing to improve, more getting closer to that kind of 100% mark. And then over on the far right, you can see when are these funds projected to be 100% funded. Now, in the case of KERS and CERS and state police, for those that aren't 100% funded, you'll look and see, well, they're projected to be 95. Why is it going to take so long? Well, they have an actually determined contribution. So that rate's coming down, and it's going to get lower and lower and lower because 2049 is the last valuation year to fund those legacy liabilities. So that's the reason why it'll keep getting lower and lower and lower. It's possible the date could be sooner. They've had good premium experience, which means they've had gains each year. Certainly TRS, they're currently projected in the 2026 val to be fully funded as well. And right now we have 3 that are already there, which is going to be kind of a question we're going to get to down the road. So clear as mud, we'll hopefully try to walk through this. The first question you got to ask is where do we provide coverage for our retirees? Well, for our non-Medicare eligible retirees, like I mentioned before, they're in the same plan as state employees and school employees, the KEHP plan. On the Medicare eligible side, each of the retirement systems has their own Medicare eligible plan that they go through different scenarios, whether it's fully insured, self-insured, Medicare Advantage, those types of different things. That coordinates with Medicare for the delivery of benefits, because when retirees become Medicare eligible, they pick up Part A, Part B. Part B has a premium, and then that plan that the systems offers works with that, provides things that Medicare Part A and Part B doesn't provide, along with prescription benefits. And then the level of subsidy, it will determine how much of those premiums are paid on their behalf. And certainly all of them have gone through some pretty massive changes over the last 15 years. I won't walk through the last couple bullet points, but if you'll look to the right, this gives you kind of an idea of premiums over the course of time. And there's certainly KEHP, you'll see the orange line, which is the single premium for their Living Well PPO. Now, we have changed the names of plans about more times than I care to over the Director Hicks is laughing. Sometimes we get confused about the names that they used to be. But I've tried to find something that was pretty consistent with what we had back in 2004. Most people chose a PPO then. Today, more people are choosing like a Living Well CDHP, a high deductible plan. But this kind of gives us more of an apples to apples in my mind of what premiums are like. And if you go back to 2004, there was a year where there were a lot of people outside about health insurance. And in that year, after that year, premiums went from $286 to $410 a month. And that's kind of when retirement systems really started to get alarmed about the cost, because all of a sudden now those liabilities are growing a lot. There's a 40% increase in premiums, which means potentially you have a 40% increase in your liabilities or some derivation of that. So to kind of look at those as well too. So you'll see the single plan orange, you'll see the family plan there on the right, so or on the blue. But then you'll see those Medicare eligible plans, and each one is listed there. And you can notice how flat that is over the course of time. The systems assume that medical inflation or medical premiums are going to grow by a certain amount each year. So if you keep those medical inflation or medical premiums flat, that means we've consistently had gain after gain after gain that have helped propel these systems, their retiree health funds, forward. And so just kind of look on the left-hand side, you can see that the Medicare eligible premiums were between $274 to $315, $274 being TRS, to where you look on the right, $211 being TRS. They have pretty well, in fact, you can just say we've had deflation over the course of that time. And those things have really helped our retiree health funds as we moved along. So, get into the weeds a little bit. And we're going to talk about Kppa and Jfrs and what did those subsidies look like. Prior to July 1, 2003, people were provided a percentage of the premium. And that premium was on a sliding scale, started at 4 years with 25% of your premium. Provided you retired, you got 25% of your single premium paid as a non-hazardous, up to 20 years. So if you retire with 20 years, you got your full single premium paid. On the hazardous side, it was a full single, parent plus, couple, or family premium paid at 20 years hazardous service. And that had to be all hazardous service. But that benefit, we'll have to note, initially it was only single coverage for everybody, and in 1982 is when it was moved towards the hazardous additional benefit. So back in 2003, there was actually two bills, 2003 and 2004. In 2003, the retiree health benefits were specifically exempted from the inviolable contract provisions. There was a very clear written out provision. It's House Bill 430. And at the time, so the health discussions are going on. The Kentucky Retirement Systems Board at that time actually met and came forward with a proposal that became the benefits for post-03s. And it was really designed to get out of the medical inflation business. So when you think about trying to fund retiree health benefits, you have the same kind of issues that you run into, the same risk, I shouldn't say issue, but same risk. You run into payroll growth, you run into investment return assumption. But when you tie it to a percentage of premium, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but your risk is what happens to that premium. So if I said statutorily you get 100% of the premium, again, going back to that 2004, 2005 time, premiums go up 40%, then that next valuation is going to have a huge load in it the next time to pay for that. So that was the decision to kind of get out of that. And you can see at the time what that bill is, House Bill 290 provided was $10 a month for each year of service for non-haz, $15 a month for hazardous for each year of service. So if I was non-haz and I worked 30 years, I got $300. Now you can look on the left-hand side. In Franklin County in 2004, it cost $286 to buy a single premium. Okay? So that was enough to pay for a single premium. Move fast forward to today, $772. Now that $10 has moved up each year, right? But it's only by 1.5%. So that amount today is $419.17. So that gives you an idea. No one likes to take medical inflation risk. But so what we did in those time frames is transition from the employer side to the employee side, if you will. Now, we do need to note Senate Bill 209 that was passed this last year increases this for career employees and really only on the under 65. So you probably need to back up and note that. Notice if we hadn't done anything in Senate Bill 209 that it's still enough to pay for the Medicare eligible premiums. So the problem that you're going to get from constituents today out of the Tier 1Bs, Tier 2s, Tier 3s is the questions they're going to bring forward is it's going to be an under 65 issue, not a Medicare eligible issue. So what they did is on career employees, it will add an additional $5 per month on their for each year that they work. So if I was a 20-year hazardous guy who's getting $419.80 now, works another year, he'll get an additional little over $100 a month added to that. And then it happens again and again for each additional year that they would stay. That being said, JFRS, prior to 1/1/2014, the benefits worked similar to the way that hazardous works, but based only upon judicial and legislative service. After 1/1/2014, new members, same as Kppa. In fact, when you look at Senate Bill 2 from 2014, it essentially, if you're a legislator or judge, you go into KERS or you go into LRP or JRP, your benefits are pretty much about the same plan, just may be difference on the interest credits on the cash balance. So for TRS, instead of things being statutory, we're like completely statutory. So like when I go in the retirement statutes and look at Kppa, I'm going to find all of these numbers built in. With the TRS board, ultimately, the amount of subsidy is based upon available funding, and the board establishes what those are. They also have a sliding scale where they pay a subsidy, the full subsidy being paid at 20 years if I entered the system prior to 7/1/2002, and at 27 years of service if I came in the system after 7/1/2002. For references purposes, I try to kind of keep this pretty simple to kind of see the premiums as you look over to the right. So let me back up one. So whereas like a KPPA member who was a pre-03, today they're going to get, if they're non-hazardous, they got the 20 years, they're going to get the 772 paid for. If they're hazardous 20 years, they get the 1884 paid for. In the case of teachers using this same health plan, they would get $512.76 paid as a subsidy, and they would have to pay, as part of the shared solution, the equivalent of the Medicare Part B premium, which is $170.10, plus what a state employee pays, which gets you to a cost of $259.24. The Medicare eligible side, the full premium is paid for those who've met the full subsidy criteria. So how is all these things funded? And I certainly wish that it was all simple and they all did exactly the same thing. I will just tell you, all these pension funds were created in different committees with different people over the course of time, different thought processes, and that just kind of is the way it is. But Kppa and Jfrs are funded through an actuarially determined contribution in the valuation. As far as employee contributions, there's a 1% of pay contribution for Tier 2s and Tier 3s in Kppa, and then cash balance participants in JFRS. I will note that JFRS participants pay 1% more prior to that date, but it funds the pension side. Employer contributions. Over time, these have gone down, but just to kind of give you a little bit of a reference, certainly KERS non-HAS, we're in the House Bill 8 world where we have a normal cost and an unfunded liability payment. But if we were to go back a couple years, just like we saw all these higher unfunded liabilities back in those days, Director Hicks, you were budgeting for a lot more money for retiree health than you were pension back in those days. So those numbers have come down, but you can see down through there individually for each system for the FY23 rates. What do those look like? How much did we fund for pension benefits? How much did we fund for retiree health benefits? And then certainly we have 3 where there's no employer contributions for retiree health because they've reached a level where there's a surplus of assets. In the long run, short to midterm, employer costs are projected to go down for KERS non-HAS, CERS, and SPRS. On the TRS side, it's certainly different. They do compute an actuarially determined contribution, but their funding is based upon a fixed statutory contributions. And historically, if you go back, they were funded with 0.75% contribution from the employee and 0.75% contribution from the state. And that was enough money to fund retiree health benefits on a pay-as-you-go basis up until we get to about 1998. And at that time, there was a measure passed that allowed the board to redirect contributions from the pension fund to retiree health by board action. That happened for a few years, and in 2004, the board said, can't do this any longer, and the infamous borrowing that we've talked about in here multiple times began. And that led up to 2010 when the shared solution provisions came into play. You have a very different dynamic where a lot of this is determined by the board, but the groups got together and came forward with a proposal. And ultimately, you saw the employee contribution rate for retiree health go up 2 to 3%, and so that teachers are paying 3.75% of pay into the retiree health fund. Local school districts chipped in as well too, 3% to the retiree health funds, and all these were phased in over time. The pre-Medicare retirees paid what was the equivalent of the Medicare Part B premium, so they paid whatever a state employee paid plus that amount that I talked about a little bit earlier. Then the state contributions were to pay for the under 65 retirees who retired on or after July 1, 2010. And that's certainly been a discussion point because the amount that is paid under this is subject to reduction based upon the needs of the Commonwealth. That's explicit in the statute. And then the state issued bonds, actually 3 sets of bonds, but I mentioned it in 2. One, to pay back those funds that had been borrowed over the course of time, that they've been fully paid, that you've had Bo Barnes talk about a couple times in here. And then transitional funding of about another $423 million in bonds as those other contributions were being phased in. And I think we just hit our last year of paying on these bonds in the budget. And then the state also continued to provide 0.75% of pay contribution like they had historically. So I mentioned before that, we have our KPPA systems, our JFRS systems that are funded kind of on that traditional ADC. If you were to look at the 2021 valuation, the amount of money that would be needed to fund the normal cost and the unfunded liability payment for retiree health in this situation would be 4.64% of pay. Now you can look up there and see 3.75, 3 state's contribution of 0.75 plus the additional is going to be an amount that's well above that. So the statutory rates are in excess of the actuarially determined contribution rate, which as we look at this fund, it keeps improving pretty rapidly, which would be anticipated when the ARC is well over that amount. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, about probably what the more things you all want to talk about than
Brad,
seeing.
are you at a spot where we can take a question?
Anytime, sir.
Representative Tipton has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brad,
Turn your mic on.
I do have a question. Chairman Feature.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, sir. And there was a lot of consternation at that time frame about this very issue. Are you going to come back next year and ask for more money to pay for this, if you will? And so there was it's ours to pay. Now, when money goes in the bucket, I don't know how it gets paid out when it comes from different sources. But, there is no specific line item for that 3%. Let me keep going. The less I talk, the better it is. So I mentioned earlier the assumption sets. And so there's kind of these 3 big assumptions, 2 of which we deal with in pensions, investment return, and payroll growth. You will notice that the investment return assumptions are a little different than what we talk about on the pension funds. So for like KERS, it's 5.25. CERS, it's 6.25. On all our insurance funds and KPPA, they're 6.25. TRS recently reduced theirs. On the insurance side, it was 8. Now it's 7.1. And JFRS is consistent with their pension and insurance at 6.5. We talked a little bit about payroll growth for certainly in the past. They follow what they do on the pension side. You note again, TRS reduced theirs recently on their financing mechanism. And then KERS is at 0, SPRS is 0, CERS is at 2. And then JFRS really didn't have payroll growth built into their dynamic. They have transitioned with Senate Bill 32, Senator Higdon, your bill, to cleanup bill, to actually put them on a true pre-funded model on all what they do. Or I should say they had an old funding mechanism that if you read the statutes and other systems from 1966, you would see showing up. This is more consistent with what the other systems do, but it essentially moves to level dollar amortization, so it's 0%. A big item in any of this is certainly medical inflation. And on the right, you can kind of see what did they assume for this year and what does it trend down to. And they all have differing periods of when they trend down to. KPPA and JFRS have one set of medical inflation assumptions for both non-Medicare and Medicare. TRS has differing ones. And so, again, kind of getting back to things, if medical inflation picks up in those Medicare eligible plans and there's not adjustments, then you could see we've had all these nice actuarial gains for years, is we could have things seesaw back the other way as well too. Same thing in the state health plan. If costs go up, potentially costs are going to go up to the system. So this is always one of those things as a board to be, not the PPOB board, but it's certainly something to look at, but the retirement boards themselves who are looking at things and understanding what do they mean to the fund, if you will. So the kind of big picture things and to think about as I'm sitting here thinking about it, and I've talked to some of you all in the past, but what happens when these funds hit 100% plus funded? Don't know for sure when that'll happen, how it will happen, but we certainly have 3 funds that are there now. We've changed benefits. We're fully funding the ARC. In the case of TRS, the ARC's more than the full ARC. In the case of KPPA, you eventually get down to a point like KERS hazardous for retiree health. The ARC ADC is 0, but you're still going to have surplus assets. And so when those things happen, folks are going to have questions of what do you do with that? Do you increase benefits? Do you reduce the employee contribution rate that some are paying? But those questions will pop up. And I don't bring that up to tell you one way or the other. I get constituent requests too. Those questions will pop up, much like Senate Bill 209 popped up this last year. In the case of TRS, you have these fixed contributions that don't change until there's a legislative change, except for the case of the shared solution for the under 65 retirees. But when that fund becomes 100% funded, there's probably going to be a lot of folks that want to see their contribution go down. And so there's going to be a question of how does this work? Who gets what? And that's probably going to be a big question as we move forward in the next 4 to 5 years, is what does that look like when that unwinds? Now, the TRS board is required to provide a recommendation for the employee contribution rate and the school district contribution rate about what it should do. But when we talk about those contribution rates, a good rule of thumb, every 1% is $35 million. So whether it's a increase in the compensation the employee has, a reduction in what the school district pays in, or whether it's how much the state contributes to the fund, those things have some real dollar values. Certainly, will we see some increased assumption volatility in the near future? As good as FY21 was, FY22, if you've looked at your portfolio, has not been kind to anyone. I've quit thinking about retirement for at least the next year. Not that I was retiring in the next year, just quit thinking about it in general. And then certainly we've had really good medical inflation experience. Are we going to start to see that creep in as inflation generally is creeping into about everything that we do right now? And then, this is one of the interesting things. The Medicare eligible premiums are very different. Each system has been pretty creative about how to try to save money on these in their individual plans. One thing that popped up as I'm looking at this is, are there things that they can find out from each other? What have you done that's creative? What can they learn from each other? But also, how do their plans differ? We have all of our retirees in one under 65 plan. Our over 65 plan is 3 different plans that are out there as well too. So with that being said, I'm going to stop and answer questions.
Representative Wheatley has a question.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you for all this clarity, even with the mud goggles on. But you're actually you just touched on the question I had when you first brought up that all the systems have a different way that they're treating Medicare eligible. Mm-hmm. So, I'd love to be able to sit down with some people who are involved with this. Is there something on a policy level that could be done to, make it as good for everybody as we possibly can? And when you say the systems, you do mean our 7 systems all have different ways that they do it?
So KPPA would have one way of doing that. TRS would have one way of doing that. JFRS would have potentially a different way of doing that. It's just, are there things, and I'm sure that they talk, you do talk. It's kind of like your cousin across town, if you will. They do talk. there's the, if you look at each system, you'll find some interesting things that they're talking about how do members interact with their drugs. Like they've hired people to specifically deal with these over 65 plans because there's enough value in hiring people that if I can just change that dollar amount a little bit, right, I can pay for this person plus provide value to the fund. So that's one question. I think one thought process might be is what do each of these plans look like? They're going to have different claim scenarios out of each one because their populations are different, male, female versus also just standpoint of health status. But maybe it might be. So one of the questions we talked about is potentially having them come in, Mr. Chairman, to talk a little bit more detail on some of these questions. This was really kind of a 40,000-foot view, but those things are good. And maybe it's that you have them come in and talk about what are the things that you've done that have been successful, that you view as successful, and can you show us how it was successful?
Yes, and I could see that. There aren't too many times that we legislate across all systems, but there does seem to be some cost savings there, and they're doing a good job. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Brad, keeping with the theme of clear as mud, Senate Bill 209. I'm trying to wrap my arms around that. The a 20-year hazardous employee, they work an additional year, they get $5 a month, total of $60. Is that what is added to what they get, or is that $60 then multiplied by all 20 years?
So think about $5 a month towards a premium, not 5 times 12. It's $5 for each year of service. So let me walk you through it. So let's say right now, if you'll see the example up here, let's say I was a 20-year on that Tier 1A. And right now I'm getting $20.99 a month for my 20 years, which is $419.80. So I'm getting $419.80 per month as a subsidy, which I can then apply to one of these premiums on the far right here, okay? What this would do, so let's say I worked 21 years. Well, now that $20.99 is $25.99 if I work another year, and I'll have 21 years of service. So it's going to go up a little over $100. So they'll get an additional $100 for every year that they work. So yeah, it's clear as mud.
Well,
sure.
see,
but only if the fund is 90% funded. So I should say that.
Okay.
And Chairman Miller can probably correct me here some.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very quiet today, and I just wanted to shout out about this bill that was passed. I mean, clearly this is a case where we're going to see savings, but it's not going to be in the OPEB side. It's going to be in the pension side. So that was a good bill. It's not just largesse to our hazardous duty employees or anybody else. It was to increase longevity, keep them in the system, and that's how we will lower our pension cost and be able to provide services. And I've said hazardous duty, but that's a perfect example of if you can get somebody to work rather than 20 years or 22 years, if you can get them to work 24 or 26 years, that's a big win for everybody. It's a win for the pension side, and it's a big win for the people receiving the service. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions? Apparently you did a very good job, and I have no additional questions.
Yeah, just one. They haven't booked those savings yet. That was the discussion, right? That's they're waiting to see what the experience pans out to be.
Seeing
But
no
yes.
no additional questions, motion to adjourn.